Chapter 16. Without the slightest hesitation, the cook strode into the dragon's study with her head held high, acting as though it was she that owned the inn, not him. Normally, he wouldn't have given any mind to her actions. She had been in his service since he bought the inn, and she hadn't changed at all over the years. But now he had a client, and his reputation couldn't afford to be dented by this woman who thought too highly of herself. He cleared his throat, folding his hands so that only his fingertips touched. He gazed at her over them, the look in his eyes one that would have sent Carinair mercenaries fleeing for their lives. The portly woman only sniffed, slamming the high-wheeled cart into his desk with enough force to chip the stout wood. She took 2 metal mugs out of her apron pocket, ladling the boiling stew into them. Her hasty, jerking actions caused it to slosh over the side and stain the man's buckskin rug. The dragon winced, but his companion smirked, nodding thankfully when she handed him one of the steaming mugs. She shoved the other into the large man's hand. He yelled again, and she chortled, taking her time to wipe the mantle clean before finally leaving. When the door slipped shut, he sighed, slowly easing his large frame back into the armchair before gingerly sipping his stew. It was hot, burning the tip of his tongue instantly, but seeing that his companion had already finished, he wasn't about to set it down. If anything, the dragon was stubborn, unwilling to admit any weaknesses. He was a big man. When he was younger, he could have put that fact to being muscular, but now it was more girth than anything. But that had no effect on the fact that he was nearly as strong as the creature he had stolen his name from, nor was his temper any less fierce. He swept his hand over his oiled hair, smoothing out the thin gray locks before carefully sculpting them into stiff waves. He had always worn his hair in that fashion, as had his father before him. He cleared his throat, grimacing down at his thick hands that were now covered in brown oil. He wiped them clean on the napkin the cook had offered, wadding it into a ball before throwing it into the hearth. It caught fire instantly, flaring brightly before the cloth burned to ash. He leaned forward and set his mug aside, balancing his elbows on his knees and then twining his fingers. He rested his fist against his mouth, looking expectantly at the man before him. He couldn't help but wonder why the man had refused to hang up his cloak, sitting instead with it pulled tightly around his body. The cowl rested low on his brow, hiding the man's features in shadow so that the dragon could only see his wide mouth. He almost wished that his mouth was hidden as well. The wide grin he received sent chills down his spine. The man's yellowed teeth were sharp for a human, looking far too much like fangs to the large man's eyes. It was a predator's smile that he received, and the dragon had no wish to be considered prey. "What can I do to help you?" He gave the stranger a considering look, his mind's eye applying an equally deadly face to the fierce smile. The man only chuckled as a response, wiping a trickle of soup off of his chin with his gloved hand. He leaned forward and set the mug aside, falling back into the chair quickly to gather his cloak about him once more. The dragon had caught sight of a black leather tunic studded with steel bolts. There had been a mail shirt below it, the steel dark as the tunic. This man had arrived at the inn a little after midday, and sat at one of the corner tables. For over 6 hours he had sat there, waiting until the cover of night to ask to see the owner. The dragon was glad to get him out of the lobby. His regular customers were growing edgy at the strange man's presence. He had joined him at his table at first, offering drink and trying to talk with him of day-to-day life. He wouldn't respond, demanding in the simplest of words to speak with him in private. The dragon had been caught off guard, and had agreed, berating himself mentally for falling into the trap the other man had set. He had made sure that his mercenaries flanked the door, ready to defend him at the slightest yelp, but that didn't change the fact that he was trapped in the room with a man that seemed more beast than human. "Owel nos ni, dragon. That is what I am called." The inn owner stiffened, his hand naturally going to the pocket hidden within his robes. He kept a thin dagger there, its form blending seamlessly into the mass of his own girth. The man seemed to smile wider, but that couldn't have been possible, could it? Though the dragon couldn't see the man's eyes, he knew that he was watching him, and that fact alone made him think of calling his mercenaries. "That isn't a human name, is it? That makes you a dragon child. I thought your kind got the creatures to work for them. What do you need of me?" The man swept back his cowl, revealing a face that made the dragon flinch. His eyes were like nothing he had ever seen, set in a sea of red instead of white. If there was any color to his irises, it was swallowed up by the rich red, leaving only a jet-black pupil that reflected no light. They were like the eyes of a shark, untouched by any sign of life. But the dragon couldn't help but think that he saw fires glowing behind them, almost as though the eyes were only stained-glass windows that led onto a furnace. His face was one of a man that had survived countless battles. fierce and unmerciful. But the only thing that stood out about him was his eyes and teeth. Other than that, the dragon knew he would be hard-pressed to remember his features. He had no doubt in his mind that after the man left he would forget what he looked like. Only that awful grin and those terrible eyes would stay with him, haunting him in the dead of night as he tried in vain to escape that horrible gaze. "Dragon child, you don't know how true your words are." His tone was hushed. By his manner the dragon knew he wasn't talking to him, but merely thinking aloud. He blinked, and his attention was once again on the dragon, something the large man almost regretted. "In this case they cannot help. I need to find someone, and I was told you were the man to see. Was I misinformed?" He bristled, calming his nerve by leaning back in the padded chair. "No, I doubt that you were. Who are you after, and why, if I may be so bold as to ask?" The man's smile had melted for a moment, but now it came back to his face in full force. He chuckled, rubbing his hands together and staring at the dragon in such a way the man began to fear for his life. "Her name is Yolna. She is the daughter of an old friend of mine. When he died, I promised I'd look after her. But you see, she ran away some time ago, and I am having trouble finding her again." His broad grin thinned into a slight smirk. "I've been able to follow her trail this far, and I know she's in one of the older districts. I'm sad to say, other than that, she's evaded me entirely." It was his policy not to ask questions, but something about this man prompted him to. "Why exactly did she run away?" The smile faded, replaced by a look of hatred so pure that the dragon started to call for his mercenaries. The look melted away as quickly as it appeared, the hunter's smile touching his lips once more. The dragon took a deep breath, making sure that he could reach his dagger easily. As far as he could tell, Oel Nosni was unarmed. But then again, the man himself looked like a weapon. I had arranged a marriage between her and a nobleman. He was several years older, and she disagreed with my decision. When I pressed the matter, she ran. It's not really uncommon. Girls her age are often headstrong like that." He shook his head, only giving a moment's pause before telling him all he knew of the girl. Surprisingly, it wasn't much. He had heard about the new forge, but it wasn't anything he had been interested in, so he hadn't tried to collect any information on it. He knew about as much of its location as Oel Nosni, that it was in one of the older districts. He knew the blacksmith was a Durkin, and that he had an apprentice from Tobri, that a girl named Yolna lived with him, and it was rumored that she was a dragon child. He had been away on business when she and the apprentice had stumbled into his inn, only hearing tell of it from the cook. She had grumbled that his mercenaries were nowhere to be seen, and she herself had had to settle the matter. He hadn't cared to mention that they had been with him, watching over his back while he travelled through the most dangerous of Alana's districts. Oel Nosni jumped to his feet, growling fiercely as all hints of a smile melted from his face. He towered above the dragon, looking down at him with murder in those fiery eyes that seemed to show no emotion but hate. He turned and stormed out of the room, his dark cloak flaring widely behind him. The dragon made no move to follow, for once not caring whether or not he was paid for his services. Without the slightest hesitation he slipped into a passage hidden behind the hearth, pulling a small lever that rang a bell in the lobby. That was the signal for his mercenaries to gather outside the city. He trusted that they would bring his belongings. They knew if they didn't, his wrath would be upon them. The stranger's presence heralded something. He didn't know exactly what, but he didn't want to be caught in the city when it happened. Oel Nosni swept through the lobby like a storm, silencing all as they sought a way to escape his deadly gaze. Serving maids and stable hands fled to the kitchen, leaving the patrons to the fate brought upon them by this man whose eyes were like none they had ever seen before. He gripped the corner of a table with his leather gauntlets, flipping it up into the air to fly through a large window beside the hearth. Just like a storm he laid waste to everything within reach, tossing chairs and benches at the walls with such force that both stone and plaster cracked. As he left, he let loose a roar that was more suited to a dragon's throat than a human's. Only a single figure had stood calm during Oel Nosni's rampage, frowning deeply as he stood just out of sight. He growled deep in his throat, a tone far fiercer than the roar of the man all could remember, yet none could put a face to. He shook his head and stepped out of the shadows, kicking up one of the overturned chairs to set it to rights once more. Before he left, he caught the cook by the arm, telling her that she would do best to leave the city while she still had a chance. She didn't believe him at first, but the grave seriousness in his eyes made her think twice. Though he despised the dragon himself, Tanoth had spent much of his time in the inn. Tongues tended to be loosened in that place, and one never knew when a certain piece of information would be valuable. The cook reminded him of someone he had known long ago, and the ornery woman had taken an unaccustomed liking to him. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded solemnly, gathering herself and the inn staff before loading them into a merchant's wagon. She reigned over the inn, of that there was no doubt, and even though her rule was strict, it was just. She left none behind, and Tanoth was sure that no one's family would be forgotten. She asked if he wanted to join them, nearly pleaded with him to do so when he declined. He told her he still had matters to settle in Alanna. She had relented, but her disapproval was plain. He turned to go, but she stopped him, handing over the reins of one of the dragon's strongest horses. He nodded to her as he mounted, guiding the horse into the alleys to disappear in moments.